next up, I've got Michael Lech, and I'm going to tell you, Michael, this is kind of new to me. I hope you are. I hope I don't sit there and say, "Oh, everybody knows you, and I'm the only guy who doesn't." Um, so Michael has joined us on the screen over here. Michael, where are you located at out there?
So this is really complicated. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. You're
Awesome.
good. You're good.
Awesome. It's all with those Bluetooth headsets. They all go very different ways. They need more QA. So right now, what you see in my background is one of the best places in Warsaw, in my hometown, which is the Royal Baths Gardens, which I had the pleasure of being in last fall. Yeah, but physically, I'm in Essex.
Physically in Essex. Okay,
Yes.
okay. Perfect. Well, that we've just left Montana and went across the pond. Sounds cool. I'm gonna tell you if in case anyone's just joining here. First of all, if there's any questions, please throw questions in on our discussion. We can see them on the side. We'd be more than happy. We'll set aside about 10-15 minutes at the end to go through those. And as I said, I've kind of poked myself in the eye. I'm kind of blind doing this, so I'm not quite as up to speed on everything as I should be on this one. But I apologize on that. So, Michael, are you able to share slides on your screen? Let's just do a check on that.
So, if possible, I would share one of my windows because I don't actually have a
That's perfect.
presentation. This will mostly really be a speech, but it will reach out to certain, let's say, celebrities and other people who spoke on the subject that I'm going to be talking about. How do I
Perfect.
do that?
In the bottom there should be a little button that says share screen. There's five buttons I think you see.
Yes.
The middle one. Click on
Excellent.
that,
Yes.
and that should be able to bring us up.
Mhm.
And if not, our moderator should. Hey, there we
Oh, yeah.
go.
Yeah, I can see
That's
it.
weird. All right.
Yeah.
Well, with no further ado, Michael, introduce yourself to our audience, and I'll let you take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm mostly a programmer who just ended up specializing in testing and then suddenly found himself a leader of various smaller and bigger groups of other engineers. And my main subject for today is going to be, let's say, a way development can unfold in certain organizations, uh, which is the rituals-driven development. That is a term I used to think I have coined myself. It's like it was my own invention, trying to describe the way certain teams were working. It turned out, nope, absolutely not. This is actually a term which is already in use. So what you see already on the screen is article by one of the Medium publishers, which is precisely about this kind of behavior. So this is actually already captured. This is already talked about. And my talk today would be around really the basics of it. So firstly, what it is, what makes it, what makes development rituals driven, where does it happen? Is it always bad? Is it just a monster that I'm going to warn everyone against, or does it have a use? Where does it come from? What can cause it? And since myself, I haven't had the possibly dubious pleasure of working in environments where it actually works as intended. The final bit will be the two typical results of it being in place, which is the need to clean up and preferably the need to prevent it, which is one of the things I do as, let's say, the core of my work. So what is rituals-driven development? In short, this is performing development actions because they are prescribed. There is some rules that somewhere someone told us we need to do something. This is now written in stone or even not. Sometimes it can be following a hype. It can be just being trendy. Like say, everyone is talking about Cucumber. we are now going to use Cucumber without really understanding why, wherefore, what is connected to it. But very often you will see that coming from policies, from certain enforced situations where you need to do something because this is how we do that, which obviously goes right against the very core of the Agile Manifesto. And the main moment where this becomes an issue to be tackled is if you are trying to develop with agility. And one reason I have the Agile Manifesto open is because one of the typical rituals that I will be talking about, well, more than one, many of them, get decried, get disowned, get heavily criticized by people you will see signing this manifesto. So this is actually a phenomenon which leads people very far away from, let's say, our ideal world of developing with agility and quickly responding to changes. So where is it bad? As I said, in any agile-driven environment because of its inquisitive, adaptive, deeply understanding nature. So if you work with agility, you want to be able to react to changes quickly. And when you do that, you want to react correctly, or at least, let's say, sanely and in a way which will mostly be beneficial for you. The moment you start looking at rules, rituals, at policies, you lose the main reason why certain action is taken. It suddenly becomes replaced with the need to satisfy a rule or to follow a ritual. It does not have to be bad because if you consider a large organization which is actually working to fairly stable set of requirements that doesn't change rapidly, that doesn't have to adapt to a market which is suddenly standing on its head, a ritualistic approach can actually be useful because you might have more junior developers, you might have more junior engineers who don't need to have a particularly deep understanding of every process. Why is it in place? What is it supposed to do? All you need to teach them is just to follow the rules. And that will actually create for you certain teams where work done in the same manner because it is responding to the same needs just over a longer time will actually be sped up because your agility is not really pure speed. It's more about responding to change quickly and in a very smart manner, while in certain cases you might just want to very quickly churn out a large amount of code, a large amount of features which are already in place. And then those rituals can help you. Interestingly, I've never have come across an organization where it actually worked. So I did actually work for a few larger companies. If you have looked me up on LinkedIn, you will see places like Prudential Financial or New York Stock Exchange or British Telecom. So we are talking about thousands of people, large teams, very, very complex structure of command. And yet none of those places that I have observed practices either going the way of ritual or actually understanding their roots and their point. I've never seen this alternate model. I mostly know it from text, from articles written by some of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, which deal with why do we need agility, or where did it even come from? What are the challenges that we are trying to attack with that? Now, once we are in this agile mindset, or at least in places which try to be agile, which have heard about agility as this most modern, most cool way of developing, rituals seem to quite inevitably lead to costly problems. One of the things that will happen almost certainly will be code rot. So you will have your practices shaped by certain requirement, but not by understanding and not by constant learning of what is the point of doing the thing. And then, for example, and this is actually just going back to one of my recent postings, someone decides we are now going to use Pact. We are a modern, agile team. We are developing multiple services. We feel they should be microservices. Now we are going to capture and test all the contracts. We are now all using Pact. And everyone is using Pact. And 80% of the people who are using Pact do not understand what is it supposed to test. And that was one of my challenges to try and overcome initially, which was how do I even explain that when you write a Pact test, which sits outside of your code base, outside of your feature code, and simply performs some arbitrary HTTP client calls, which then you believe are the right ones, what's wrong with that? So then you have to actually go all the way back to why is Pact in place, what is it supposed to do, and why it has to be a test. Another a bit grim example, which I have taken a liberty to slightly modify, but also copy and paste from one of the code bases I was cleaning up after ritual-based development, is using Cucumber. So Aaron mentioned Cucumber as one of the English, plain English frameworks for test automation. Obviously, Cucumber is a part of BDD, which is a massive subject which goes very well beyond testing. And you would even say that testing is not really the point of BDD, it's just one of the outcomes. But if anyone of the listeners has exposure to Cucumber, you will see a massive problem happening here. So we have a developer who was told to use Cucumber, who was told that it describes your code and it should perform the test of the code, while never actually explaining why is it this English-like format, what should this English-like format capture, how should it do it, what does it have to do with product development, what should be product owner's input on it. It's just told, sorry, you have to write Cucumber. This is our new policy. And this is the literal result. So suddenly we have a Cucumber which has a starting point described by the keyword given. Now I'm trying to avoid going on a massive tangent regarding Cucumber and Gherkin and BDD, but rather stick to code rot as a result of ritualism. So essentially, in a complete Cucumber scenario, the steps that you will always see, as long as it's a test of a feature, will be a when and a then. And the code, which is usually hidden, which is always hidden under these sentences, will need to stick to certain rules. So for example, the code which realizes our when should always be code pretending to be our user.
Hey, Michael, I
Yes.
didn't want to. I just realized that you're just showing the rituals driven development screen.
Oh, it did not change. It
I
did
don't
not
think it's changed.
change.
I'm sorry. I hear you typing. I see you
Yes.
talking about it, and
Yes,
let's see if
that's
we can.
interesting because I have tabs open, but not the whole screen. Let's see if I can change my sharing. Oh, show this tab instead. Okay.
There we go.
Yes,
Beautiful.
I found the option. Yes. So
No
thank you
problem.
for turning my attention here because I was actually looking at the code and I didn't see the miniature of the video. My bad. Again, more testing. So this is already corrected. Yeah. So this is an example of a very minimal scenario in Cucumber, which is actually doing what, well, not really, which is trying to do what Cucumber was made to do. It's still struggling because the point is slightly different. It's connected to product development. But what you will get in ritualistic environments is this version. So we have setup, and we immediately have an outcome. And then the code underneath it, the code that I was working on, was actually not really concerned with those steps being separate and generally describing a scenario. And because generally in tests, we deal with scenarios. We have our actor, our user, or some external system. We have our entry situation, and then a scenario unfolds, and action is taken, and our system responds. And this is very nicely captured by Cucumber. Cucumber is essentially made to describe those scenarios in a manner good for scenarios. So it gives us our scene setup in a given or a step or a set of given steps. But there's always a very, very important thing, which is the user or the actor's action, which then needs to have a reaction from the system. This is really the core, while the given does not have to exist. There does not have to be any particular situation in which we start interacting with our system. So all this knowledge is part of a massive discipline that is behavior-driven development, which has ties to other things like domain-driven design, like arranged act assert as the pattern of testing, and many other things. And the moment you have someone saying, oh, I just want you to use Cucumber because this is the norm, and someone is made to use Cucumber because this is the norm and not because it has a benefit, you will get those very, very weird scenarios, which very quickly also become very hard to debug. Because when people develop those, they will follow like immediate needs. So in the example of the application I have here, we had a web app which would open, which would perform a set of actions. And all of that was wrapped in the underlying code in a manner which actually jumped all the way through. Arrange, act, assert, all happening in our first line, in our initial given, including even some assertions about the final state of the app that the user would be judging for correctness. And then our then step would sort of backtrack and try to get like a sub-scenario developing from there. So that was actually a very, very interesting case to solve, to even find out what it was supposed to describe. Again, not because of any ill will or someone trying to hide anything, because again, the same code base had a very exhaustive set of unit tests. It was just trying to follow a direction without ever being allowed to understand it. So that's one of the main things that will happen when you do your, let's say, policy-driven, your rules-driven, your rituals-driven development in a place which tries to be agile. There will also be quite a lot of bad stuff happening in your on your management side. For example, if you have a bigger organization trying to do Scrum, you will almost certainly have someone being extremely particular on getting velocities and estimation and getting the points on your stories. And if you struggle with that, you probably will be told, well, you need to get better. You need to get better with estimating. And then we have our Agile Manifesto. And Mr. Ron Jeffries, one of the signatories, is most likely the person who have invented the story points in the early days of Scrum and methodologies based on extreme programming. And well, 9 years ago, that's what he had to say. They turn out to have been a bloody mistake. Because they are numbers. They are so tempting to use primarily, to use religiously, to have them as this great measure for a manager to create a numbers report, to measure your success, well, with numbers. And those of you who have worked in more than one team will very quickly notice, firstly, every team has its own velocity, and velocity can only make sense within a team, if you even track it. Because the team across in the very same office will deal with slightly different issues with a group of slightly different people who tackle problems slightly differently. And what is your 3 points of complexity will be a 5 for them. What is your 1 point will be 2 points for them. But at the end of the day, it might very well turn out that when it comes to usable code that someone at the end of the pipeline can interact with, they are not so different. It's just that the numbers that they have come up with over some sprints, over some cycles of development are completely different, and they actually mean something ever so slightly different. Myself, I very often fall into the trap of translating points into days, which is obviously a trap, but it's sometimes useful. In ritualistic environments, you will most likely have someone who will require you to report your velocity, to make efforts to have that number somewhat stable. And if it just so happens to be lower than the other teams, you will probably be considered underperforming. And in terms of what happens to planning, what happens to story refinement, what happens to all the ceremonies, all the practices, is quite destructive, because suddenly your way of reasoning, which when you follow the basic agile principles makes sense, suddenly works against you. So that will lead to teams which will try to copy their pointing practices from other teams and then try to follow them. And that, of course, never comes out right, because if you try to use somebody else's numbers, you will always underestimate. Like I have yet to see a team which has underestimated itself. Sorry, I might be struggling with my English here, but generally, someone asked to use somebody else's estimations will be very, very conservative and very careful. They will do their absolute best to avoid a situation where, for example, their velocity is dropping or it's not high enough. Yeah, so they will be trying to be very safe in what they do. And again, that was like a live example I had earlier this year, which again can be prevented very easily. Yeah, first thing you do, if you see a problem at the moment of story refinement, where you see a single ticket and there's a massive discrepancy in how people estimate it, this means that there is no team consensus of what is complex and what is not. And generally, you will have your pairs of developers, your testers, your product owner converge on certain common understanding, which means that for the starter, perhaps you need to drop the points. If you absolutely have to have sizing, give it the famous t-shirt sizing, and then get somewhere from there. Another thing I have done in the past was, if there is a lot of enthusiasm for points without going all the way into the dark side of trying to equate or equalize velocities across teams and try to have people use other people's numbers. If someone just wants you to report a velocity, you drop your sprint close for a time. You go scrum ban, you don't cut off the work of the developers at some point, because that's another stress point. That's another moment for which a developer has to be ready, has to be complete. You can drop it for a time and let them actually just pick up tickets, complete them, continue to the next one, which will then give them certain understanding of which stories they have come up with are complex, which are simple, which of them can be given how many points, and then how much of those have gone through in, say, in a week or 2 weeks. Which is obviously just getting back to what it really means to have Scrum in place, to have Scrum in place, to have story points, not a certain direction coming from above that you need to have that many story points in that many days. Because again, that will, just like the choice of technologies will rot your code base, a choice of metrics, which is not exactly working for the team, will rot their practices, their soft side. What I've seen it also do was a degree of isolation. So if a team is told to do user stories, but for example, they never actually work with client-side product people or with client or with customer, those stories do not mean anything to them. So then you have the very foundation being eroded, and then you have very strange business cases. Again, I'm not sure how familiar how many of you would be, but usually a feature file actually has a bit of a sales pitch included in it, which says that, oh, no, we are not debugging this page. As an app user, I want to see a detailed view of my newest message so that I know what my messages look like in the app. And that would be your typical working sales pitch where someone knew who is the user, what is it that they are paying us for, and what is the benefit that they get for it? What is it they're getting for their money? This is one of those things that get lost in ritual-driven environments because they are not really about having a close contact between the customer and the developer. There's actually a dedicated team which will do that and will transform it and so on and so on. It will not really do it in an agile way. So that when you try to shoehorn those techniques of behavior-driven development, of extreme programming, of developing with agility into a framework which is not really made for that, those sales pitches will not really mean anything to the developers. So they will usually skip them. They will leave them to the product owner if he's being heckled for writing them. And again, another bit of knowing what is the point of us spending our time in the office creating software is lost. And as this kind of, well, essentially rot continues, that will also undermine the morale. Because again, practical results come from what really is the core of the organization, not this agile facade that is then being undermined by rituals. And for example, you will have your contract tests where the provider tests, those of you, again, who know contract testing, you know you always have to have your consumer, which will be either a user or another program, and you will have your provider, which will be the bit that responds. You will sometimes have the tests of the provider written on the consumer side, which is to say people who might not even see the code of the thing they are testing are writing what seems to be test for it. And obviously, they will always realize just how pointless that is, how besides any sort of benefit it has to be. Similarly, on the management side, You will see very strange things happening in all the metrics. You will see massive leftovers from one sprint to another, because since everyone is afraid that their numbers are not right, they will shape their work around having those numbers right. So for example, I will not commit to testing 5 stories this week because I'm not sure they will actually be done correctly. So I will underestimate how much I can do. And then let's say 3 days before the end of the sprint, nobody has work to do. And then we start something new, and then we have a massive leftover. So essentially, both the processes and the code base tend to get derailed by that. And obviously, nobody wants that unless you happen to have a different model. And this is probably the core that perhaps I should make by now.
Hey Michael, I gotta jump in here again. We're staring at the post from Ron Jeffries. That's all we're seeing on the screen. Yeah, we switched back there.
Oh,
Sorry, like I said, I got poked in the eye here, and I'm missing this. I apologize to everyone.
I will probably need to do something about my color theme because I do get a notification to change the tab, but it's very inconspicuous. Yeah, so when I change what I see, it's not really so obvious. I really apologize. So again, what we now see in the middle of the Cucumber example is the sales pitch I mentioned when talking about rotting business practices, agile ceremonies, yeah, where those 3 lines in the middle tend to get pretty much forgotten, because nobody really cares why something is done. Because, well, why something is done? Because I'm told to. Okay, let me see if I can keep track of the tabs a bit better. Yeah, so I got to, like, say, this grim story of what will be the things that will happen to your code base, to your tests, especially tests in any newer or less known framework or technology or model. So in my experience, the 2 most common victims of rotting because of the rituals would be Cucumber and Pact. Literally like 80% of something really bad happening in the code base will have a very high chance of being one of those 2, because they are not really very well known, to be honest, while they are very popular. Like you will hear almost any modern manager talking about Cucumber and talking about BDD. You will not really meet half as many either test engineers or developers who really deeply understand BDD as a model, or even just Cucumber as a tool. Because again, just as BDD is a massive discipline, Cucumber, which is just a bit of it, is also extremely powerful and very complex thing, which can do a lot, and where you can also get lost. Now, usually, ritual-driven development is not something done deliberately. You will not have like a higher manager saying, I want this large team to work to rituals. Typically, there will be an attempt to work with agility, which then will get undermined by certain ugly practicalities getting in the way. And one obvious one is high churn. If you have high churn, you will have the case of Pact that I had not too long ago, which was a couple of people who were quite good with Pact got hired. They showed it to the managers. They showed them what sort of confidence can be derived from using it. And that immediately became a policy that was put on the project documents. And then those people left without passing on the knowledge on what really is the point of Pact. How does it need to be tied into the rest of the test code to be useful, and so on and so on. Another thing is obviously following hypes and busts. So certain technologies are very quickly, very hungrily adopted by the best meaning people who just want to stay on top of the times to not get left. And obviously the very, very classic story is the story of Cucumber, which had quite a few years of build-up. Then suddenly, once BDD essentially became a success story in a few places, it became extremely loud and extremely popular. So it started being introduced in many places which were not remotely ready for it. And then it started being a problem. It started being problematic. There was I thought that maybe Cucumber is not so good because we don't really know how to write it. The scripts that we are getting are not really good. Well, if you develop with rituals, your scripts will not be good anyway. And several years later, between this hype and this great appetite for using it and for also commercializing it, we got to another side, which is Cucumber dying? Because that's a very serious question. And in February this year, the last of the persons who actually took part in creating Cucumber left the company, which maintains it as a commercial project, which I believe used to be HipTest, and now it's trying to be Cucumber Studio. So now I expect a massive turn away from Cucumber and attempts to do something else, which is probably going to be a very, very interesting thing to observe and see what was happening. Because honestly, there aren't so many realistic alternatives to Cucumber as a solution, especially where it's used for the real purpose. However, when that happens, when you have those quick movements, especially across multiple companies, to a technology, to a solution, and then back from it, you will again have a lot of legacy code which is still tied to this already dead trend. And the only thing that keeps it going in this place is the rules, even though, for example, nobody really wants to do it. And probably this would be one of those like really massive red flags when you want to avoid this code rot, this process rot. If there is a technology that nobody wants to use in the team, then just don't use it. The other obvious source of ritualism is what I have already mentioned, policy enforcement of tech choices, of practices, like Pact tests are now required. Or this mid-manager now wants this metric, so now you will do it his way. Another thing is, and this ties back to hypes and busts. When hypes and busts tie into policies, you will usually have people forgetting that introducing a new way of working has a cost, because people are already working. There is already a machine which is spinning, and suddenly we are introducing Cucumber. Like, God forbid, we are introducing it alone without the whole BDD model around it. So that will be extremely costly because there will be a whole new tool which has its own preferences on what the code should look like, where should it sit, how it should be structured, what sort of a level of integration should be used for the main body of tests and so on. And all of that suddenly changes. And obviously, the only people who will see, or the people who will see the most of that will be your people on the ground. Your test engineers, if you have your model of spearheading new stuff by the test engineers, or the whole team, including developers. And sooner or later, it will be everyone, because you will not really have maybe a different formulation. I have never seen like a properly wrong, like a purely wrong way of using Cucumber when, for example, the scenarios would only belong in the tech team, like never touching product development. There was always at least the understanding that BDD sits between the two and spans the two, and you need to engage everyone. So the cost would be initially test developers, then most likely your product owner, and then depending on the team dynamics, it might get forgotten or not. It might just instate itself as this another ritual that just goes on without much reason behind it. And then we get to like more, let's say, efficiency harming syndromes or symptoms and their causes. Essentially, if you have a large organization, you will sometimes have favoritism or some politics. And the case which I mentioned at the very beginning, which was a consumer team writing contract tests for the provider, which is obviously completely pointless and completely wrong, basically stemmed from the fact that one team was checked, was controlled, was verified for having proper contract coverage, and the other was not. The other team was not really asked to deliver certain tests, so said, no, we are not going to write them. So suddenly the ritual not only does not have a point, it also just gets executed by a selected group of people whose task it becomes to make sure that certain rules are adhered to, which obviously, again, undermines morale. But let's just say I'm happy that I didn't have to rebuild a team which went through that. There were different problems I fixed, but not like this far end, like if you have years of this ritualistic development going on, picking the pieces of that up. I'll get back to that soon. Another thing, of course, is when you have a larger organization or you have, let's say, a less experienced management, they might not realize how different two teams can be just across one office, which again will lead to one of the ritualistic behaviors and one of the problems resulting from it on the process side. And of course, if you have this appetite to develop with agility, but you always have the deadline. You always have that ultra urgent deadline, which will override the spikes, the proper time spent on results of team retros and such. That will also immediately derail this agility as a process that actually lives and replace it with pure ritualism. On one hand, we do call it agile ceremonies, but once we get into ceremony, we get very fact-like. So when we do our retros, we do try to stick real to what really happened in the sprint. What do we think we can do about it? Do we need to? And so on. Once, for example, we have this permanent urgency, whatever we agree is now a tech debt will forever remain tech debt, will never be repaid. And that, again, will rot your code, that will also rot your processes, and that will erode your morale. So when you have this going on, sooner or later, someone will realize we are really, really bad off. And there are two things that can be done about it. I had the dubious pleasure of doing one and much more honest pleasure of doing the other. One is, of course, retroactive. You already had your ritualistic development going for some time, and there's essentially a rotten code base which needs fixing. That can be, to a degree, remedied if you are allowed to. So what you can do is you can take your pointless Pact scripts, which are not really contract tests, and you can change them while pairing with everyone on the team. So that would be your cleanup. You will show what really is the point of this tool. Why are we doing those tests? Why are we writing this? Why do they need to sit, say, on the unit test level and not anywhere else? What is the cost of trying to push it higher? What is the problem with trying to test too much or too little? And as long as it does not break any of those higher policies, that should work. And again, in my recent placement, I did manage to fix at least the Pact side of things, essentially by a lot of explanation, by a lot of pairing, having sometimes mobbing session, which were just Let's take a few steps back. Let's have a new look at this particular bit of Pact.js code and rewrite it to be an actual test, to actually work in a manner which is driven by the requirements for the consumer. Let's make sure that when we write the provider verification, all the provider states that we define are actually tied to consumer requirements. And that's one of the more perhaps tedious, but sometimes also quite satisfying bits of undoing the damage, because usually you will have an opportunity to learn a lot and teach a lot, because again, people who fall into ritualistic patterns of development do not do that deliberately. It's not like I decide, oh, I don't really care about programming. I just want to have it out of the way. If there is any possibility to do the engineering work right, pretty much anyone I ever met in development teams will jump on it. Like, yes, I want to write it the right way. I want to have the benefit. I want it to make sense. I want to understand this code so that when you move to another company, I still know why we write it this way. Sometimes it's not so easy, especially when you have the rot in the process side, because that's something much more embedded in the organizational structure, and that typically will not really yield. So if you wish to improve the situation in certain organization by any degree, you will probably focus on those not conflicting bits, which can be repaired without possibly running into any politics or policies or rules. While this actually more ineffective, I would say, side, the organizational, would be countered in the way I liked more, which is prevention. Or not even prevention, working in a way which does not even leave it any sort of a hole to get through. So one thing you can do is try to reduce your churn. Because as I mentioned a bit before, one of the reasons why people turn to rituals instead of always understanding what they do is because the expert is gone, because all of the experts are gone, and the code is still here and the rules are still here. So trying to reduce churn is one very, very simple thing. Obviously, sharing knowledge is very useful in those cases. And that can also be done as a cleanup part. But again, there seems to be a lot more bang for your buck if you do it before the rituals start to happen too much. The other thing, and that already ties my own approach to combating the code rot and process rot coming from ritual-driven development into agility. So essentially, agility is mostly a result of people working in fairly small companies, not really massive organizations delivering massive projects, more like smaller companies trying to keep up with rapidly changing market. And that means that a lot of those mechanisms that tend to lose their meaning and their understanding between people who exercise them, those practices come from small size of an autonomic team delivering some functionality, which obviously leads to flatten the structures. If there is an absolute need for a mid-manager to translate a vision of the seniors to something remotely understandable to people on the ground, probably agility is not the way to go. Probably if this is such a massive thing that it needs mid-managers to translate it and to keep an eye on everyone all the time, probably agility is not the way to go. And that's also how I got to reading those examples of how ritualistic approach can work in the larger companies, was by seeing what is the core of the problem, and the core being a massive organization trying to be very agile. And Probably just recognizing what you are. Yes, are you an own startup or are you prudential financial? And acting in a manner which is consistent with this core nature of your endeavor, of your organization, will be the way out. Because if you don't try to force agility into a massive team, which mostly needs to churn out a lot of code to pre-existing or pre-structured requirements, you don't really want the burden of agile ceremonies, which are mostly meant to allow you to quickly change your course. You are not changing your course. You actually want to stay your course and be very fast on it. On the other hand, if you do have a case for using agility, flatten the structures, probably with no mid managers. And again, the perfect example of that I had the pleasure of working on was Fuse Universal, the team under the lead of Mr. Tim O'Donoghue, the CTO, who was the only person I responded to. And the only people that reported to me would be people on the ground, which means from your software engineer, from your tester to your CTO, there would only be one manager. And that meant everyone was very close to both sides of the process. That is, I would be steered directly by a C-level, and I would get my feedback directly from the people on the ground. If something seemed to take too much time, to not make a lot of sense, I would hear it immediately. So simple, very, very simple, if sometimes brutal operation of just flattening structures will do a lot to alleviate that. And as we all know, it has been tried before in different ways. If I recall correctly, GitHub has done it years before, but without really working on the very senior management's approach, and that did not work out so well. We will see what happens in Facebook or, well, in Meta. We are hearing some interesting signals from Mr. Zuckerberg. Again, that will be a very interesting thing to observe. Can they actually flatten the structure while being such a massive company? So yeah, essentially, yeah.
That's very interesting. I was going to say that we do have about 8 minutes left to wrap up.
Yeah.
This is this the what we're showing over here? Is that an article that you wrote out there? Is that on the slide that we got out there?
Sorry.
Is that the slide we're looking at with the 166 is out? Is that an article that's on? It looks like it's.
So no, I did not have a link or a slide to illustrate flattening. Okay. Essentially, I would just go for flat structures at Meta.
Okay.
Yeah, well, and that should give us some reference to how this bit is being done. Yep.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about being wary of rituals and what is already in place. I've actually currently on a project where we started out looking at Cucumber, and then I looked at I said, the framework in the Cucumber approach is a 4-layer approach. You've got your feature files, and you've got your glue code, your pages, your glue code, and then your base. And when I was working with the project, I said, maybe we don't have to go entirely with Cucumber. We could just do a straight up Selenium project, which has its advantages and disadvantages on that. I did want to ask.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what you are looking at is perhaps Cucumber coming alone, without actual BDD, because to look at Cucumber and its massive cost and say, oh, I'm willing to take that cost, you need to have all the bits in place. That's really the biggest problem, I think, for anyone who dares to try BDD. Either really everyone is on board and you have your product owners very actively shaping the plain English part, and you have your test engineers who will spearhead the glue and the frameworks and the page objects if you do it in a UI-driven way, and developers who will, in the end, implement the features. So there's a massive lot of, let's say, team area that gets touched by BDD. And I would say it will only work if everyone understands what's happening. Yeah, and because if you're missing any of that, yes, the pure end-to-end Selenium suite will do a lot better for you.
Okay. Aaron is actually asking, what makes a ritual good or bad?
It's the point of it, yeah, because rituals mean that we repeat certain actions and don't really think a lot about them. And in some cases, actually, they are great. Like, say, you do your TDD. So you start by writing your test. This is actually a ritualistic behavior. And sometimes you might feel some rush to actually get to writing your feature code, but you stop yourself, you obey the ritual, and then you have your confidence coming from actually implementing the TDD approach. So this is a micro scale where even in strictly agile environment, this ritualistic obedience to writing your test first will give you immediate benefit. It starts being a problem when it continues without the real deep reason. Like there is the ritual, but there's no faith behind it.
I get that. You know, one of the other things I mentioned early on was talking about velocity, and that is actually one thing that I was in on my current project where we are adding more people, and our velocity we were measuring is like basically how many test cases did we get automated each sprint, and we were doubling every single time. And I'm like, okay, one of the things I had to do was level set with my managers and say, this isn't going to keep doubling and doubling and doubling. We're not going to. They're going to plateau at some point, and I think the most important thing I learned out of that was giving a heads up to your management and say, okay, it's great that we're going up, but at some point we expect to level off, and then when you do, nobody's surprised that you didn't. Okay, you did 500 test cases last time. Why didn't you get to 1,000 this time?
Yeah, this is the magic of numbers, isn't it? Yes, my number is growing. Things are good,
yeah,
which is obviously a trap. Yes, I need to understand
it
what
is.
my number describes and what it really means.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other things I also point out to people, we've also seen that there's a meme out there where they have people talk about how do you get the rocks in the jar. I think it's like if you put the big rocks in first, then you can't get the pebbles and the small stuff in there. And I use that. I said automation is actually in inverse of that. Is the first things we're doing is the small pebbles are the easiest, smallest tasks, and they're easy to get done because they're very small. But at the end, when you get a couple of months into this, the only thing you got left are these huge test cases, these huge end-to-end things, and they'll take longer to accomplish. And that's another reason why we're plateauing on that. Is that kind
That
of like?
I suppose, I think it depends on your approach. Like, how do you run your automation project? Yeah, because if you're trying to be careful, if you want to start small and innocuous to keep going, you will have that. And again, this actually fits into this better part of my assignments earlier this year when taking something relatively small, relatively harmless first under work was the most successful because there was a benefit and there was really no risk to speak of. In terms of, let's say, fundamentally reshaping how your organization works efficiently, you might want to start big. This is what we have done in Fuse Universal. It was actually, I think, a massive gamble, which must have caused our CEO almost a heart attack. We actually said, yeah, like we are going for BDD. Like right now, we are hiring a product manager who is a great BDD fan. They hired me after I think a half year of looking and like a whole day on-site interview. And they hired two excellent developer leaders, both backend and frontend. And that was a revolution. For I think 2 or 3 sprints, the metrics for tests were just dead. Like if you were going like a micromanaging judge looking at the numbers, you'd probably fire myself and everyone else very quickly.
Oh, no.
However, I think about 2 months in, our numbers started going up. We finally got a unit test suite for the front end, which was in React Native. And the best part was that about 5-6 months after this like really, really tumultuous moment of tackling big things first, we did have very clear cases of our product owners being able to immediately spot fake bugs in the reports. Yeah, as a company, we had a massive problem with a lot of bug reports which were dubious, which we did really a lot of work to even find out if we should do them. And at some point in one of the meetings, which were rituals between, let's say, the seniors and the product, on which were quite focused on bugs and problems that the users had with the app, the product owner started saying, "Sorry, this is not a bug. This was never required of us. Come on, let's get it on the roadmap." And yeah, so this is the kind of change you get if you actually do this big Las Vegas gamble.
This is great. This actually, I think this dovetails really nicely to our end here. Michael, I want to thank you very much for being a guest here at Zappletech on this session. Is there any last things, anything you want to share where anybody can get a hold of you, or YouTube channels or anything like that?
There should be probably somewhere on your list a link to my LinkedIn.
Okay,
and my LinkedIn in turn should lead to my GitHub pages.
Excellent.
Because actually, so far I haven't been very active in terms of sharing my knowledge with the broader audiences, which means I do not have a YouTube channel. I mostly have the GitHub pages and the LinkedIn.
That works fine. That's fine. I have the same thing. I've got a Dark Arts Wizard GitHub account, and my job makes it so busy I almost never get to add anything to it. So with that, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I'm gonna let you run. And again, thank you very much for the session.
Thank you very much for having me. I don't see any questions from the audience, which means that probably I went so deep on the management and that nobody had a question to ask.
Yeah, there was one comment. David was saying he agrees. Well, it wasn't really a question. He was just saying, don't use Cucumber unless your team embraces BDD. I'm all for that. If you're embracing it, that's cool. And if not, that's straight up, or take a look at alternatives. Always keep your mind open.
So, by the way, I didn't see it. You might want to keep an eye on that because it seems that the questions from the audience are appearing very late for us presenters. Because I see questions for Aaron. But I don't see the newest one.
Well, if there's other questions, we can get them over to you. We can answer them offline. Again, Michael, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to let everybody know we're going to wrap this up. We'll do it again next month. It's either going to be me or we'll have our other alternate guest out there hosting the meeting. I guess we're going to wrap this up here. Thank you very much for everybody for joining. We'll catch you next month. Take care and cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.